The last one I want to deal with, and I am moving right along, I know that, the cases of Jerome Bolsec and Michael Servetus. These are the ones that, Jerome Bolsec you may never have heard of. I'm going to fill him in briefly. Michael Servetus, raise a hand if you've heard of Michael Servetus. Yeah, all these hands go up. Okay, we're going to do Bolsec first and then Servetus. Calvin and his colleagues in Geneva were aware of the fact that their understanding of what it meant to be a Christian was fairly recent in terms of when it had started in Geneva. They looked back to the early church. They didn't think they were innovators, but they knew that in terms of their starting point, it was really quite recent. And one concern they always had in Geneva and elsewhere was that if they tolerated what were perceived as wrong beliefs, that's to say, views of the Christian faith that were not in accordance with traditional beliefs, that then their opponents would blame them even more. Right? So the Catholics would say of the Genevans, look, those crazy heretics, see, they even adopt anti-Christian views. So the Genevans are always aware that they're on a fairly narrow walkway. And on one side are the Catholics who are looking for them and trying to show them as being misled. On the other side, there are people with views whom the Genevans thought were just wrong. And you had to try and find a middle road. So the case of Bolsec. Jerome Bolsec was a medical doctor. He was also a Frenchman, and he was a Carmelite friar before he left Catholicism and became a doctor. He was a private physician to a nobleman. The nobleman had an estate near Geneva, a nice house, and so the nobleman is there, and Bolsec, as his personal physician, was there with him. Bolsec had an interest in theology and would come into Geneva and basically attend the public Bible study sessions. And in 1551 he did so, and he went to one of these public Bible study sessions, and the pastor who was leading the Bible study, not Calvin, another pastor, was treating of a Bible passage that had to do with predestination. And the pastor just simply taught the Genevan point of view that predestination was God's plan, and so on and so forth. Bolsec stood up at the end of the Bible study and said the pastor was wrong, Calvin was wrong, and Geneva was wrong, and that predestination made God an author of sin, and that was wrong. Unbeknownst to Bolsec, Calvin walked in while he was still speaking, and Calvin refuted Bolsec, and at the end of the meeting, Bolsec was put in jail. Now you might think that's a bad thing to do to someone who had a different theological view, that you would cast them in prison. But Bolsec had not simply said, well, this is your view and this is mine. He had suggested that the Genevans' doctrine was false, and that's a serious charge. So, the Genevans put him in jail. They investigated his case. They sent letters off to other Swiss cities trying to see, well, what do we do with this man from what he taught? And actually the letters came back rather mixed. People said, yes, predestination clearly is a solid Orthodox doctrine, and Bolsec should not have criticized it, but they didn't really have a unanimous view on what should be done with Bolsec. So at the end of the day, the city council banished him from Geneva and told him never to return. Bolsec was upset. The nobleman, who was his patron, Bolsec was his physician, the nobleman was kind of upset that his doctor had been put in prison. The nobleman did not think this was good. And the nobleman and Bolsec both returned to Catholicism after this, so that didn't work out too well for them, or at least from the Genevans' point of view. And Bolsec later on wrote biographies of both Calvin and his successor, Theodore Beza. And in both instances, Bolsec's biography was the source of many really negative legends about Calvin. I mean, Bolsec was really upset about how he'd been handled, and he took it out on Calvin and Beza by writing these biographies that circulated in Catholic France for generations afterwards. So you think, well, that's not good. But Bolsec was just kicked out, he continued his life, and so on and so forth. The case of Servetus is obviously more serious. Servetus was also a medical doctor. Servetus was a Spaniard, almost the same age as Calvin, probably born in 1510, 1511. And Servetus, a Spaniard, did his studies in Paris. Calvin and Servetus would have been in Paris at almost the same time. They were supposed to meet at one point, but Servetus never turned up to the appointment. Servetus, the medical doctor, did some really important medical work. Among other things, he was important in the discovery of the pulmonary circulation of blood. That's kind of a major medical fact. But Servetus, like other medical doctors at the time, had a side interest in theology. In Servetus's case, this took the form of anti-Trinitarianism. Servetus denied the Trinity. He said, specifically, that Jesus Christ was not divine. It's a key part of anti-Trinitarians. Anti-Trinitarianism was a movement that did take root in the 16th century. The descendants of anti-Trinitarians today are Unitarians. And Servetus had these views. He published on these views under his own name in Latin. And clearly that caused Calvin a lot of discomfort, because Servetus and Calvin were in correspondence with each other, each of them trying to show the other where he was going wrong. And Calvin at one point even sent Servetus a copy of his own Institutes, right? So Calvin has his Institutes, he puts it in a package, sends it off to Servetus, hoping to convince Servetus of the right way of thinking. Servetus sent it back with comments in the margin saying where he thought Calvin was wrong. Calvin did not warm to this at all. He did not think that was a good thing. So the relation between the two men was clearly a difficult one.